Hello, and welcome to our series on using your math curriculum virtually. I'm Melinda Griffin, a researcher here at American Institutes for Research and a member of the Rhode Island Intensive Math Intervention Project. I'll be your host throughout this series. So we've created a series of mini modules to help you think through teaching math virtually. In this first module, we will discuss getting started with virtual math instruction. Future models will consider what to teach, planning your teacher-directed learning, and thinking through how your students will do their math work independently. Please note that I will be using the terms virtual teaching and distance learning throughout this and other sessions. There's a distinction between distance learning and online learning. Online learning is planned to be delivered virtually from the very start, whereas we are going to be adapting and thinking through what you normally would be using in person with students and transferring that to a virtual environment where teachers and students interact from a distance. So throughout this series, we're going to be adhering to some guiding principles around distance learning. The first one is to try to use what you've already been using in your classroom. This is going to be most comfortable for you and your students if you're working with something you're already familiar with. You want to make sure you keep things clear and simple. Avoid using too many resources or too many technology applications. We're going to be combining new learning with keeping skills sharp. The instructional time you have with your students each day is shrinking dramatically. So things like keeping skills sharp are going to be moving to more of an independent learning event that your students do on their own. And most importantly, you want to make sure that what you plan instruction-wise is going to work for all families. Hopefully your school or district has reached out to parents to find out who has internet access and who doesn't. You need to make sure all of your students have access to the mathematics to make sure your classroom is equitable, just like you would if you were in person. And that means whether your students join you in an online environment or whether they're perhaps doing more things with just paper and pencil at home and some phone calls from you. All right, so let's get started with our first module, how to teach math virtually. In this module, we're going to focus on what teachers, students, and parents need for a virtual environment, the format you will use for your teaching, and how to structure available instructional time. So let's get started with what teachers need. So you're going to need online access to your current curriculum and your teacher manual. You're also going to want to make sure you have access to student materials. This might include workbooks, worksheets, or other online interfaces. If you have an online curriculum available, this is going to be so much easier. You should be able to assign problems directly through the publisher portal. And if not, it will be easy to copy and paste things to make something that you want. You might also be able to have students access through this portal directly as well to get to games and activities you were already using in the classroom, and then you can just continue to work with them at home. If you have students offline, you're going to want to make sure that any paper materials you need to create are similar to what you're providing students online. You're also going to need a virtual platform and hopefully some training on how to use it and troubleshoot any issues that may arise. Your school or district has probably chosen a platform for providing instruction. This might be something you were already using, such as Google Classroom, or it could be something completely different, such as Zoom or WebEx. We now have virtual engagement added, and you may or may not have any familiarity or experience with this. I would encourage reaching out to YouTube. There are tons of tutorials out there that can help you get started. You already wear a lot of hats as a teacher, and I'm about to add another one to your wardrobe, and that one is tech support. Because parents and students know you, so as they learn these new ways of communicating with each other, if issues arise, they're most likely to reach out to you first. You want to make sure you know which of your students have internet access and which ones don't. A lot of schools and districts have already done an inventory to find out which students don't have access, and many are working with service providers in the area to see if they can get access for these students. So there's a good chance that eventually your students will be able to go online. In the meantime, as said before, you want to make sure that you're going to keep materials and instruction equitable for those students as well. You're also going to need some guidelines on communicating with parents. Your school or district may already have a weekly plan in place to reach out to parents. This will tend to be more on district or school issues. So you're going to want to think about, is there another part that you want to communicate to parents just about your math instruction? And make sure that you reach out to them frequently. So let's move on now and think about, what do our students need? They're going to need access to a virtual platform or some other plan in place so that they can still do learning of mathematics on their own. You're going to need to establish some norms for online behavior. In the classroom, your students were used to rules and expectations that you had in place when you were physically together. But now that we're in a completely different environment, those have changed, and you're going to have to establish some new rules for behavior. Your students need to know what they're going to learn that day and, if possible, for the week. That way they're going to see how the mathematics connects. In classrooms, we often do discovery type lessons where we don't necessarily want to put that out there at the beginning, but you're going to be doing a lot more direct instruction in a virtual environment. So it's going to be helpful for your kids to know exactly what they should be learning on that particular day or lesson. You want some clear expectations on independent work that students need to complete. Depending on your age of your students, they may have a little bit of independent work or a fair amount of independent work. Kids need to know how to access that work, how much time to expect to complete it, what do they do with it when they're finished, and when do you want them to submit it to you. They're also going to need to know, what do I do if I have questions? And also, we don't want to forget that our kids need the opportunity to interact with you and their peers. In the classroom, by this point in the year, you'd become quite a bit of a classroom family, and your kids are missing you and they're missing their fellow classmates. So even though we need to maximize our time teaching mathematics, we want to make sure we attend to our kids' emotional learning as well. And that means having a chance just to be together as a group. So needless to say, parents are dealing with a lot right now. You may be one of those parents who finds themselves in the dual role of doing daily childcare in school for your own children, in addition to teaching your regular students. We often communicate with parents normally in the classroom, but it's even more critical during this time when they're trying to coordinate their whole family's day. If possible, give parents a weekly schedule for the school as a whole. That way they see what students need to learn across all subjects for the week. It's also important to give them a plan for math for that particular week. Well, I love to think math is the most important thing in the world. They do have to think about it in terms of how it combines with other subjects. And when we give them a math view for the week, we want to include the topics and specific learning outcomes that you expect students to work with that week. Do not stress parents further out by regurgitating the math standard. And make sure whatever language you use can be understood by someone who does not have an education background. If you have the capability, an online calendar with assignments can be really helpful. If your school already uses a learning platform where parents go to see homework assignments and grades, continue using that as before, but add some more information in about the lesson taught each day in addition to the independent work assignments. It's really important that you keep those learning outcomes there so that parents can see how the math is building across time. And just as it would be in the regular classroom, you cannot assume that parents know the math you're teaching. Publishers will often provide a family or home newsletter to accompany each unit. You could send this home as usual, but it might be helpful to tailor it to what you will be teaching that week exactly. So now let's move on and think about preparing to teach and the format that you're going to use. Needless to say, none of us have a regularly scheduled life anymore. Things are changing rapidly, both for you as well as your students and parents. So we're going to need to think about things in terms of synchronous and asynchronous learning. Synchronous learning is when students are actually with you online or perhaps by phone, if you need to for some kids, and you can actually talk back and forth directly in real time. Asynchronous learning is done independently. So you might have something pre-recorded that students watch. This could be practice problems that they're working on their own, games or other things that you want them to play. So as you start looking through your curricular materials, start thinking about what is going to fit into each of these two buckets. You also want to make sure that you have some time just for check-in with your kids. You are a really important person in these children's lives, and they are missing the connection with you. So make sure you have some time just to talk with your kids and see how they're doing as a person, not just with math. So now let's move on and start thinking about a daily schedule for teaching. So some things to keep in mind, first off, is how much time do you actually have to teach math? Knowing that kids need to be learning in other subjects as well, and you may or may not be the teacher for those other subjects. You need to think about where you can schedule breaks for yourself and for your students. So in the regular school, there's a lot of movement. Kids move between centers, they go to lunch, they go to recess. As a teacher, I see very few teachers that actually sit down much during the day. So now we've moved all to a virtual environment and we're doing a whole lot more sitting. If you had movement breaks or things that you use with your kids in the classroom, see if you can make those available for your students at home. And if you're teaching all day long or running groups with your kids, make sure you give yourself a break between those groups if possible, just to recharge and grab a cup of coffee. You want to make sure you allow time for human interaction as well when you start those online sessions with your students. They're going to be excited to see you and excited to see each other. So give a little time for human interaction before you dive right into the math. You're also going to need to help your students with time management. In a regular school, we have a lot of physical cues that tell us when to do something different, such as morning announcements, we have a bell schedule, we hear the whistle on the playground, or your kids aren't going to have those cues at home like they did at school. So see if you need to provide them some tools such as online timers or things like that, that they can use to help budget their time when they're working independently. Probably most importantly, you need to realize that you cannot do it all. You're not going to be able to teach a math lesson the same way that you did in your classroom. There is just not the time or space for it. So you need to make peace with that and start thinking creatively about how you can maximize the time that you do have with your students each day. So here's an example of what a daily schedule might look like. This is from Washington, D.C. Public Schools. You should check with your school administration to see if they already have guidelines in place for you. So for our students in grades 3 through 5, we're looking at less than 2 hours a day of direct instruction across all subjects. For students in middle school, we're looking at closer to 3 to 4 hours. And we want to keep in mind that independent work that we want students to do beyond this probably shouldn't be more than maybe 15 minutes at most per subject per day. So let's think about some general pointers for virtual sessions. Make sure you have documents or websites that you're going to use with your students queued up before you start the session. This saves you precious time looking for them when the kids are with you. If you're going to use any videos, you want to have students actually watch those on their own and not on the platform together. You're already going to be using a lot of bandwidth, and if you try to go to videos, they're most likely to glitch or the sound is going to be off. You want to remember that visual context is important. Our kids tend to be visual learners, so if you're going to be doing something with them online, make sure you have something visual that they're following along with what you're saying out loud. So this could be virtual manipulatives, it could be a whiteboard, virtual whiteboard that they're looking at, something that gives them a visual cue in addition to the auditory cue. Remember when you're online with your students to reinforce digital citizenship. This comes down to having classroom norms and thinking about what's appropriate behavior when you're on an online environment with other people. Most of all, relax and enjoy being with your students. There are going to be glitches and there are going to be problems, but this too shall pass. So just laugh it off and carry on and think about the memories that you're all making together. So in summary, remember that we're entering a brave new world together, and we all have to get used to what we're now calling school. So expect that you're going to be doing some tech support during your first few meetings as everyone gets used to joining one another online. Think about what you need to feel comfortable, as well as what your students and parents need, and try to pull in things that you used in your regular classroom as much as possible. Make sure that your plan includes students with online access, as well as those who do not have access yet. And you want to make sure you create weekly and daily schedules and plan to share them with your students and their parents or caretakers so they understand the math that they need to be learning. So on behalf of the Rhode Island Intensive Math Project team, I'd like to thank you for joining us today, and I hope that you'll view the other modules in this series. In addition, we have some great resources available on our Google site, so be sure to look there if you'd like some more information on teaching math. Thank you. Have a great day.